Welcome to the Real View podcast, where Ohio Realtors connect you to innovators and influencers, keeping you with the real view of real estate. Whether you're a broker, agent, first-time homebuyer, industry leader, or just happen to stumble upon our podcast today, you can expect to hear tips, tools, tricks, interesting information, and so much more from the experts in Ohio's real estate game. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Real View podcast. I'm your host, Allison Wiley. With me today is our special guest, retired Marine Staff Sergeant Eric Alva. He will be speaking to us at our Diversity Summit in just a couple weeks, up and coming in October. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we will be live and in person, and we can't wait to hear from you, Eric. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Allison. I'm very grateful and fortunate.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Like I said, you'll be presenting, I believe you're a keynote speaker at our conference, which is going to be great. So we don't want to give away too much of what you'll be talking about in October, but we did want to bring you on to share a little bit about your story and things that you've experienced in your life, maybe to some individuals who won't be able to make it to our conference, and to other listeners, across the country who I think would benefit from hearing from your story, because it's a really cool one. You've been through a lot, have a lot of experiences, and are going to share some awesome stuff with us today. But before we get into that, I want to kick off with our Real View question, which is, what is the best view that you've ever seen?
The way things are today and everything, and it's something that flies in the front of my house, and even coming home from war, when you see people at the airports or everyone, for me, my view is always the American flag. I love that. I love the flag. I mean, I could stand there and watch it wave or fly in the wind for hours. It's just very important to me as far as the beauty of this country and the patriotism and what I fought for and almost died for. But that's my, favorite view of all, even when I'm closing my eyes at night.
Oh, I love that. It never gets old. And there is just something so beautiful about when the sun is shining and it's like flowing in the breeze and everything that it stands for. You're right. That's awesome. And a view that we get to see, a lot if we're lucky, which I think is cool too.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, like you mentioned, you are a veteran. You are a man of service, been to the Iraq War. Tell us a little bit about how you got started before we get into kind of your experience, in the war and everything like that. How did you get started? I believe you're from a military family, if I'm correct.
You are correct. So both my grandfathers were in World War II. My father got drafted to Vietnam in 1967. So he served 67, 68, and even, during the Tet Offense, which is very historical. So they both were in the Army. My mother's father was in the Navy. So after high school, I did not want to go to college. I did not want to go to college. And so after high school, it's kind of humorous because I was a band geek. I played the clarinet, and there were several of us in the band who were talking about joining the military, and of all branches, the Marine Corps. So I'm only 5'1", so I come from a short family. And so as everyone else was joining the Marine Corps, it took me a little longer because, of course, one, I didn't weigh enough. I only weighed 90 pounds at 18 years old, graduating high school in 1989. And so that kind of delayed my process. And then two, talk about my identity back then, and this, we'll get into that about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, but back then, the prohibition for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals was that you could not serve in the military. So when you went to the recruiter's office, whichever branch of service it was, those questions were on the applications. And so it asked you about your sexual orientation. And if you had put yes to having feelings or relationships with someone of the same sex, then you were automatically disqualified. So the humorous part about that is that, I lied about that on my applications, but then I was truthful to tell them I had epilepsy when I was little, because I did have epilepsy. So, and I didn't have it anymore. So that halted my process big time, because they were like, well, you have seizures. And so it was just interesting, but I finally did get into the Marine Corps, and I had to gain the 12 pounds, and I went off to boot camp right after Desert Storm in March of 1991. And I didn't know how it was going to be. It was tough. It was hard, but I did it. And I fell in love with the Marine Corps. I fell in love with the esprit de corps, the discipline, the camaraderie. And I went from, California to Japan, back to California, back to Japan. And I mean, over the years, I was re-enlisting. And of course, by all that time, then of course I was coming home from Japan a third time in the summer of 2001, which of course led up right before, coming up now, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And so that's pretty much after 9/11 is when things really changed, not just for me, but I think for all of us, even still today, as we see, today. But I was very fortunate to serve in the United States Marine Corps for 13 years.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your service. And
Thank you.
yes, yeah, we appreciate it, and thanks for everything that you've done, for our country and coming off of 9/11. You're right. So 9/11 happens. Where are you? And then how does that kind of, catapult you, entering being a part of the war?
Well, 9/11 happened, and I was stationed in California, specifically 29 Palms, which is kind of northeast of Palm Springs. And when 9/11 happened, as you see current news right now, as you and I are talking, we went into Afghanistan to, of course, go get justice for what had happened in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. And so my unit wasn't slated to go to Afghanistan. But then in a whole year later, in the fall of 2002, because of the speculation, I'll call it that, the speculation of weapons of mass destruction being, discovered in Iraq. So then majority of the units on the West Coast, especially 1st Marine Division, we were now put on guard or put on alert that, we would possibly be deployed. And it just like, right now, everything that's going on in the fall, because now we're getting into the fall, September, October, November, December. So by the end of 2002, we had already heard we were going to be deployed to the Middle East for possible invasion into Iraq. Of course, as history turns out. So I actually was deployed to the Middle East on January 15th of 2003. And of course, for the next couple of months, we trained, we set up camps, we set up everything, and we waited for word from the commander in chief, of course, the president of the United States, to announce when we would go into Iraq. And so that happened in March of 2003.
So you get deployed, you enter Iraq and became injured. Talk to us about, that, what happened with that. I believe you were the first one injured in the war, if I read that correctly.
I don't have a certificate that says,
No.
first one injured or anything like that, but I will share with you, Allison, as most of the country saw, and you can see on like YouTube videos or the History Channel, whenever they have anniversaries about talking about Operation Iraqi Freedom. We got word, I think, about March 19th that, we were going into Iraq. So then about March 20th, that night, or I would say that evening after sunset, about 7 or 8, that whole day we prepared. We tore down the tents. We lined up the vehicles. We made sure everyone had their ammunition. We prepared. We lined up all the vehicles. I was on a logistical convoy. This is March 20th of 2003. We waited till it got dark, like I was mentioning, after sunset, and we started moving forward. We started moving towards Iraq, and somewhere in the middle, like and I was on a huge convoy, probably 55 plus vehicles, and you're traveling through the desert, and it's just dark. We didn't use our headlights. We used night vision goggles. Those were in the front, or the passenger in the driver's seat, and I was the passenger for my vehicle. I had a younger Marine who was assigned to me as my driver, and eventually we stopped in the middle of somewhere in the, I don't even know what time it was, but it was dark. And I fell asleep on the dashboard with my hand, and because it was always waiting, like what's going to happen next. And then that's when you heard the bombs had started to drop. That's where most people hear the term that was coined shock and awe. And so the bombs were being dropped, and it sounded like thunder. And so I'm not real big on New Year's Eve and July 4th. So I usually wear headphones like you're wearing right now. I cover my ears because it brings back those memories. And so after all that night, the next morning, we started up the vehicles. We crossed into Iraq, which I was with 1st Marine Division. We were one of the very tip of this. We were like the forefront of leading U.S. forces. And our mission that morning, or leading up into noon, was to secure the city of Basra. And again, being on this convoy, I was at the end of it. And when I got into this position, which was called Azubair, right outside Basra, I had stepped out of the vehicle once to use the restroom, twice to get some supplies from the rear of the Humvee. The third time, I left my canvas door open because I was going to eat my MRE, which is our meal ready to eat, because I had missed all my meals the day before as we were getting ready, because I had 11 Marines under my supervision that I was worried about them. I wanted to make sure that they were good to go. And so I didn't eat. Well, here we are now in Iraq. We were waiting outside the city limits of Basra to see how we were going to go in because we knew we were already going to face some of the Iraqi army resistance. And I decided to eat my MRE. And so as I was warming up, I took 2 or 3 steps to which I don't even remember because next year will be 19 years. What it was I was going to do. I don't know if I was going to go sit in my seat while the MRE was warming up because I was warming it up on the hood of the vehicle. I don't know what I was going to do because that's when the explosion went off. I stepped on a landmine. And so I was awake for the whole thing. And by all accounts, I don't know, again, I don't know how it was determined, but they were like, you're the first American injured in the Iraq War. I mean, because everywhere I went, I was the first person, or I was like, you're our first, we're going to take care of you. And I'm like, why does everyone keep saying that?
Yeah.
What do you mean I'm the first? Like,
yeah.
And it wasn't a race to see who could get injured first. But
right.
So by all accounts, by, the Department of Defense, the United States Navy, United States Marine Corps, because we fall under the Department of Navy, the Marine Corps, I was only in Iraq for roughly about just 3 hours.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah.
So, wow, that's crazy. So that happens, the explosion happens and you're awake for this and you have memory of the accident and kind of the events following. So that's kind of something, when you hear about traumatic injuries happening that, people say, I don't remember a thing. I don't remember anything, but you do.
I was awake for the whole thing. Oh my God, my eyes just starting to tear up.
Oh,
no. I mean, it's important to talk about because it's like anyone else. When you go through a tragedy, of course, you have to process it. And but yeah, it never just talking with you because you're so kind. Thank you. And I get emotional because I did almost lose my life. I lost my right leg. My left leg was broken. My right arm suffered severe nerve damage. And I mean, but. What does a person do after that? Of course, here we go, because now we have Afghanistan going on because it was going on since 2001. Now we have Iraq going on. You have 2 wars going on. We were still recovering from 9/11. I mean, it's very fresh. So in a way, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to all the listeners, at that time, I always tell people the wars were popular. The wars were popular in a sense that everybody had yellow ribbons around their trees. Everybody had yellow ribbons around their porches. You saw the yellow magnets behind cars that say, support the troops, support the troops. There was American flags flying over bridges. Everybody was big because we wanted justice for being attacked. And so everybody always wanted to give things to the men and women who were getting injured. So I was kind of popular or thrown into that spotlight because I was the first, and people from the Washington Post, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, you name it, the Wall Street Journal, everybody wanted to interview me. And so it was like, I ended up on Oprah Winfrey. I ended up in People magazine. I had become kind of like, which I don't like to use. I was kind of like a celebrity or something like that, and so, but as time went on, of course, I was retired from the United States Marine Corps in 2004 after 13 years and 3 months. And it's interesting because I still believe, as my mom used to say when I was a kid, everything happens for a reason, Eric. And sometimes I used to challenge her and say, Mom, that plane was not meant to crash, or something like that. But I really, in a way, believe that because if I hadn't gotten injured, where would we be today? And that's part of my story, which I'm excited to share in October with the Ohio Realtors and everybody else who's listening, because it is important to talk about, what I've gone through and where we are today.
This episode of The Real View is brought to you by the Ohio Association of Community Colleges. Ohio's network of community colleges provides accessible training that accommodates the busy lifestyles of aspiring real estate professionals at half the price of a traditional university. With convenient locations in every part of the state, as well as online options, Ohio's community colleges are your smart choice for pre-licensing education. For more details or to start the journey to a real estate career, visit the education page at ohiorealtors.org and then click on the pre-license course locations. Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of a perfect transition. Your life post the Marines and after you retired and became a veteran, that wasn't the end. You didn't just, take your new life and losing a limb. You didn't just take that and live in your house and never, talk to the outside world again. You actually became an activist and an advocate for the LGBTQ community, especially in regards to the don't ask, don't tell policy, which you mentioned a little bit, as you were explaining your story on getting into the military. So tell us a little bit about first what that policy is, and then kind of how you became an activist and an advocate and eventually ended up, changing this policy, moving forward, changing history, kind of moving forward. Tell us a little bit about that.
So, don't ask, don't tell was meant to be, I guess, I don't know, maybe a starting point to allowing LGBT service members to serve in the military. But I don't think people really thought about this. And even for me, because I remember when it was proposed, and then I was already in the military. And it was interesting because Marines, they're always so narcissistic and they're always the last to conform to policies and regulations. So when we were talking about doing this, it was hard for me because, of course, I was in the closet, or I was hiding and nobody knew I was gay. But when you hear the rhetoric, especially Marines, they're gung ho and they're like, oh, we don't want those people. And they, people's just being a kind of a generous word, because they would say very ugly, vulgar things. So when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was, here you go. It was a campaign promise by a candidate running for president. And so I'll say it that much. So we all vote, or at least we should all vote. and so candidates make certain promises. And so at that time, when President Clinton became president, one of his promises was that if you elect me president, then I will open the military to allowing LGBT service member or individuals to serve openly in the military. Of course, the country was not ready for that. I think at that time, I even did research, and only 32 or 34% by USA Today poll, American people supported allowing the LGBT people to serve in the military. So what Don't Ask, Don't Tell did was, remember I mentioned it earlier about those 3 questions or 2 questions that I had to so the part was that those questions were removed from all applications for anyone joining the military. It was a compromise. We will allow lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals to join the military, but we're not going to ask you anymore. The compromise was that even though we're letting you serve in the military, you were not to tell anyone. And so here you go for people listening. And what I tell people, what that policy did, what that law did was it was not just discriminatory. It was oppressive. It forced individuals like myself or like you. Now, if you have something to be who you are, your true identity, it forced individuals like myself every day to go to work, and every part of the day, 24/7, 365 days a year, to lie about who you were. I'll give you an example. Most people, when you go to Thanksgiving weekend, we all go to our relatives or we go to our friends, and then we all come back to work on Monday because now we're in the holiday season right before Christmas. And as humans, as people, as professionals, we're not, intrusive, but we are, respectful, and we're curious. So we ask each other, how was your Thanksgiving? Oh, where did you go? We ask each other questions. We do that on commutes. We do that in the airports. We do it on trains. We do it on subways. We do it in general when you're just talking to someone because you're being respectful. You see a ring on someone's finger and you're like, oh, you're married. What's your wife's name? And that's an ism. So going back to having to lie about who you are, for me, I would go to the Marine Corps ball by myself. People always wonder, why don't you have a date? Don't you date? People always wonder, like, what did you do for Thanksgiving? Or what did you do this weekend, Eric? And it was always having to lie who I was with, or lie about why I don't have a girlfriend, why I don't go to the Marine Corps ball with a girl or something. It was always being on guard. And if it was always worrying that if you slipped up, you would lose your job or even possibly be imprisoned for breaking the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It was very stressful. And so that law, of course, even affected all of us like myself who went to war. Because if I had a partner, or remember at that time too, there was I think 6 states that allowed legal marriage. So even if you were legally married, like Vermont or Massachusetts, you still could not put that on your record in the military because you would break the law, even though the law for Maryland Massachusetts or Vermont was fine. But if you were to get killed in action, hopefully there's someone that on your side of the family could alert your spouse or your partner or your significant other. Because what if, and that happened, that people would write their loved ones, and there was codes, people set up codes, like you were your college buddy and from your fraternity or something, and then one day those letters stopped coming and you're wondering, you don't hear anything. And if you weren't in contact with your significant or your partner's family, then how would you know until you see it in the news that they were killed. And there were people who had to hide who they were and then never got to see their loved ones again. And they found out, by some other way. But don't ask, don't tell, even though it was meant to be, something that was now going towards as far as equity, it's something that actually propelled a discussion. It propelled a discussion that why, we should allow LGBT service members in the United States Armed Forces.
Yeah, and when you kind of became part of the catalyst and one of the founding fathers, I should say, to change this policy, did you ever think that you would play a part in that? Was that something kind of when you entered the service and had your experience with being gay in the military? Did you ever have your sights set on this, or thought that you would become the big change maker to change this policy?
No, and thank you for saying founding father, Allison. But there were people way back. I don't know if you ever heard of the name Leonard Matlovich, and Google it when we get off. And remember Greta Kammermeyer. Greta Kammermeyer, they made a movie about her serving in silence, and Glenn Close played Greta Kammermeyer. And I say that because these were the individuals who started the conversation of why there were LGBT. And come on. People have to know, even before 1776, our independence, there were gay people serving in the military all this time. There were some people who would say, there's no gay people in the military. And I'm like, really? But, there were people who started this dialogue way before me. So I didn't think I was going to become one of those individuals. What catapulted me into speaking out was, I lost my leg. I lost my right leg. I shed blood for this nation. Going back to my view, when I look at that American flag, I believe in its freedom. I believe in its independence. I believe in people's happiness, their respect, their safety, and that we should stand by those last 6 words with liberty and justice for all. And here I was, who almost died and now have a Purple Heart, but I was reserved from having the rights to what other people had. And so I remember it was in 2005. And of course, here I am now, private citizen again, going back to college. I started majoring in social work. And the way things happen in life, it's weird because now I get into social work and I really wanted to just help people like wounded, talking to people. Then I discovered diversity, stigma, I discover oppression. I discover all kinds of social justice, learning in my education. And so in 2005, that November, and of course I live in Texas. So we overwhelmingly passed a state constitutional banning same-sex marriage. And I shrugged my shoulders and I thought, that doesn't pertain to me. I don't have anyone. I don't ever want to get married. And I was completely wrong. So in the following year, I saw 8 more states. I started paying attention to the news. I started paying attention to what was going on, even about my life and other people's lives that I had fought for, people's lives that we lost on 9/11. And I started thinking, this is unfair. I went to war to fight for people's freedoms so that we wouldn't be attacked in the democracy of our nation. But I don't have those rights, all because I'm gay. And so that's when I finally got up the nerve to contact the Human Rights Campaign. And I didn't know who they were. I had my very first partner who I was with at the time was the one who introduced me to them. His name is Daryl Parsons, and we're still good friends. But he introduced me to them. And I remember he tried to put the sticker on my car. And I was like, I don't want that sticker on my car. It was the little equal sign that they have for their at the Human Rights Campaign. And I contacted them via email late one night, sent them an email, told them who I was. I was the first American engineer of Iraq War. If you don't believe me, I've been on Oprah, I guess, like thinking that's part of my resume or something, that it's true. He's not lying. And so they contacted me, and it was weird because when they contacted me, and it was October 2006, and they said, we would like for you to work with us. I'm thinking, okay, what do you need me to do? Do you need a phone bank? Do you need me to go to, Canvas and sign people up for membership at gay pride parades? What do you need me to do? And of course, here it was. They're like, we think you could be our spokesperson. And I'm like, for what? They're like, well, do you know about our organization? I said, no, not really. They're like, well, we actually work on legislation and advocating for the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals' civil rights in this country. And we think you could be our spokesperson for when we introduce legislation, or when a member of Congress introduced legislation in 2007 for repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the light bulb went off. It was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that law. That's the law I served under for so many years. And that's the law I lied about all the time. And so on February 28th of 2007, it was Good Morning America broke the story. And it was actually Jake Tapper, who's now on CNN. And I still keep in touch with him, not as much anymore. But if I hadn't been in the news before, like on Oprah or People Magazine, because I was the first American injured in the Iraq War, now here it was coming out 4 years after my injury, and that the on Good Morning America, that the first American injured in the Iraq War was indeed a gay Marine.
Wow.
And now is out to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Wow. So not only were you, dealing with coming off of the war and your life-changing injury, but now you're also dealing with another huge life event, which is coming out and sharing this story and being open and standing in the fact that you're gay. And now you're, like, for lack of a better terms, a celebrity too. What was that like? What, were you going crazy? How did you, because I think either any one of those, situations would probably be a lot for anyone to take on. And you were kind of dealing with all of those at the same time.
One of the biggest things I had to think about first, because I always worry about them. I have a twin sister, I have an older sister, and my mom and dad are still alive, and I have two nieces. I considered my family, what it would do to them. Because again, going back, my father being a Vietnam veteran, and he has a lot of veteran friends they all talk to. And my mom was a second grade school teacher and all her friends. So the reason I bring them up is because when I got injured and I was on the news locally, constantly every day at the beginning of the Iraq War, they were also being affected. Everybody knew who they were. You're Eric Alva's mother. You're Staff Sergeant Eric Alva's father. Oh my God, let me shake your hand, sir. Your son is a hero. My sisters at work were being affected. So what I knew, what I was about to do was going to affect them as well. And sure enough, the next day after my mom went back to work, and I told them what I was going to do and that I wanted their support. And I did hesitate. And I said, if you don't want me to do this, then I won't do this. And my father was like, no, I'm proud of you. You need to do this. Because they knew I was gay. And my mom was a little apprehensive, but I think she was apprehensive for the fact, she goes, I don't see why you need to do this. I said, because it's the right thing to do. She goes, when people speak out, remember Martin Luther King or, Medgar, people get hurt because people try to silence them. I said, I am willing to take that chance. I said, I have to tell this story, or I have to speak out because it's the right thing to do. So, but sure enough, the next day after I came out, after on Good Morning America, she goes to school, and one of her teachers or colleagues comes up to her, and she's like, oh, I saw the news yesterday. She goes, I will pray for you. Like if something had just been like, your son is like, it's bad. I'm sorry he's like this. And so my mom told her, from what my mother said to me, she said, well, I'll pray for yourself.
I love that. Oh my gosh, your mom sounds awesome.
So it's like, even to this day, here it is 2021, and they still get recognized, or my parents, or they've gone to restaurants where people buy them dinner, and they're like, well, someone paid for your bill because they know who your son is. And my parents are like,
they're okay. Over it. They're like, okay,
they're over it already. Yeah. And so anyways, but it was not something I had expected what was about to happen, because then, of course, here it is again. That's 2007. It's almost time for another election. 2008. You have all of these candidates. Here you go. And you have Hillary Clinton, who could possibly be the first female president of the United States. You have Barack Obama, the first African-American who could be president of the United States. You have all these people making promises again, and one of the promises on the Democratic side was, if you elect me president, I will repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And of course, here we go, 2008, election comes, Barack Obama makes history, first African-American president. And then, of course, in the first year of his administration, we didn't see anything towards Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I did testify on the House Armed Services Committee because we had already introduced the legislation. So we were restarting the process from 2008 to 2010. And it was there that we saw, what was already going to happen. When we were going through that process, it was unfortunate because now the bill that was introduced would repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell for lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. It was not all inclusive. I say we because I still apologize to my transgender brothers and sisters who are serving openly today now. And that's another story. But we didn't include them because we were doing the research, and a lot of people were not comfortable with transgender individuals. As we see in the news, all these anti-transgender bills, even in sports and bathrooms. And so when we finally succeeded in repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, again, it was not all inclusive, but we succeeded. And I was very honored. I was very fortunate that I stood right behind President Barack Obama's right shoulder as I watched him pin his signature to, changing the law. And even though he did that on December 22nd, 2010, we had an implementation phase to go through. We had a probation phase to go through. And so the actual first day of the services being open is coming up next month, September 20th of 2021, because it was September 20th of 2011 that the services were open to lesbian, gay, bisexual individuals. And so here we are 10 years later. And people have to think that, because here you were, don't ask, don't tell, and even the prohibition, you were firing your best fighter pilot. You were firing your best cook who cooked for an admiral. You were firing your linguist people who could interrogate the enemy. You were firing people in intelligence. It didn't matter what job you had. You were firing people solely because they were gay or lesbian or bisexual. I mean, and that really didn't do justice for us while we were trying to fight the war on terrorism. And so here we are, 2021. And we've seen how history has kind of, revolved, because I think when we repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it answered the question about what do we do with the couples that are married from Vermont, Massachusetts. We can't give them federal benefits. So then the argument of same-sex marriage came about. And then here we are. And now here we are, 2021, and new president, and the ban has been lifted. We're now there. And I have a handful of transgender brothers and sisters who are serving openly right now in uniform. So, I mean, it's been a long, but it's not over. It's not over because there's so much to. I'm not just gay. I'm also disabled. I lost my leg. I'm a veteran. I speak on veterans' rights. I'm also Native American, and I'm also, Latino, Hispanic. And so I'm a big feminist. I'm a big advocate for immigration. I'm an advocate for people's rights, human rights. And again, it's not something that I ever thought I was going to be, but here I am. And as I grow older, when I first started this in 2006, my hair was all black, and now it's pretty much all gone. It's all gray, but I love it. I wouldn't change anything today.
And like you said, it is almost everything happens for a reason. And, you have to look back on your life and the things that you went through to get you to this point. How can you say that it was for any other reason, that it all makes sense, that it all was, a part of a bigger plan? Because look where you are today, and look at the advocacy and lives that you've been able to change by your experience and what you went through. It's really incredible.
Thank you. And it's a two-way street, because I've been speaking. So after coming out on Good Morning America, then I got on a speakers bureau with Kepler Speakers Associates, and I have traveled the last, almost 15 years. I have met so many wonderful people. It's such a blessing and a gift to meet you, to share my stories. But I've also heard people's individual testimonies, and it's a blessing. It's remarkable because we all have a story, and it's just, I love hearing, people's personal testimonies, even though some tragic. I think the dialogue that we have to remember is that, we're only given this one life. I share that in my talks, that when I end is that I wake up every morning being grateful. I have a huge perspective on life, even though, again, I'm not perfect. I lose my patience sometimes in traffic or things like that. But I kind of regroup and think how fortunate I am. But I tell people, we're only given this one life. And when you wake tomorrow, because tomorrow's just a word, it doesn't exist. When you wake in the morning, then you've been promised another day.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true and great. And to hear that you still have this wonderful, amazing perspective after everything that you've been through is really incredible, and I think an inspiration to us all. And I can't wait to hear more from you in October at our Diversity Summit just here in a couple of weeks. So make sure, to our realtors listening, that you all get registered for that. OhioRealtors.org will give you all of the event details and information. You could hear more of Eric's story. We got a little preview, but I'm excited to hear more and definitely dive into some more of the topics that we talked about today. But I think this was great. Thank you for your service. Thank you for the work that you've done, to make this world a better, more inclusive place for everyone. And thank you for your time speaking with us today.
Well, it's a two-way street, as I mentioned, Allison. Thank you. It's such a blessing. And I'm always grateful and fortunate that I get to share my story, and just, hope that anyone going through some sort of, oppression or difficulty, that I hope that it inspires or empowers individuals that you're not alone. No one should ever feel like they're different or alone from anyone else. We are all here together.
It's so true. We have more in common than we don't. Absolutely. So thank you again to our listeners. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you next week. Thank you for listening to The Real View. That wraps up today's episode. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at ohiorealtors.org/therealview and on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Have questions, comments, or suggestions? We want to hear from you. Email us at podcast@ohiorealtors.org. We'll see you next time.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.